Welcome to Dungeon Academics. My name is Thomas and I will be your instructor. In this video, I'd like to propose a new dice mechanic called Rolling with Dominance. I'm making this mechanic to go with a subclass that I am designing for barbarians called the Trollsbane Barbarian, and there'll be a link flashing up on the screen somewhere in the corner telling you where you can find a little bit about my design philosophy for this. And at some point in the next couple of days, I'll try and make a finished version of it. The mechanic I need is different from Advantage. I need a mechanic that offers a bonus in very specific circumstances and a bonus that can happen irrespective of if you have advantage or disadvantage on a set of checks. I need it to be different from Advantage without breaking the rules of bounded accuracy. And to understand what's going on and why I'm inventing this rule, we need to have a discussion about what bounded accuracy is, because bounded accuracy is one of the great mechanical innovations of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. It was introduced in the 2014 version, it carries through to the 2024 version, and it's brilliant. I love it. Okay, what is bounded accuracy? Well, roleplay games are all about making skill checks, attack rolls, and other dice-based rolls. And to represent whether you are better or worse, or more likely to succeed or less likely to succeed at something, you get bonuses to your rolls. In older versions of Dungeons & Dragons and many other roleplay games, these mechanics were represented by bonus numbers that you could add to your dice roll. And a well-experienced player with a well-experienced character could have many sources of these bonuses. So you'd be making a dice roll and potentially adding numbers from 7, 8, or even more sources to that dice roll. And this created effectively 3 problems. The first is just the amount of mathematics that players and dungeon masters were required to do for every check or attack roll. If you're adding lots of different mathematical modifiers to a dice roll, that's a lot of little bits of maths that you have to do every time a dice roll happens. I made a video about cognitive load in games. You can find it again in one of these corners. But the long and short of it is that doing too much mathematics in a roleplay game slows it down and makes it feel stressful. It makes it feel like maths homework. And I'm saying this as a maths teacher. You do not want to be forcing your players to use their brain power to do mathematics. They should be using their brain power for storytelling and decision-based purposes. That is the fun part of games, not the adding numbers to a dice roll. So, without bounded accuracy, there was just too much work adding lots of numbers together. The second problem that bounded accuracy solved is also related to these modifiers. Roleplay games are games. Players are given challenges that their characters have to succeed at, they have to overcome. And it is a natural urge to want to succeed in the game. Nobody is playing a game of Dungeons & Dragons to lose. So it is natural for players to want to accumulate as many of these bonuses as they can. I don't think players should be discouraged from this. They want to succeed, and in order to succeed, you have to give yourself the best chances possible. The problem is that players will spend so much time and effort trying to get bonuses on the dice rolls that the game grinds to a halt. Rather than the fun part of the game, storytelling, decision-making, action, people are going through their character sheets and their equipment lists trying to figure out which bonuses they can use. Bounded accuracy introduced advantage and disadvantage as a way to limit this. It doesn't matter how many sources of advantage you have, you get advantage and you roll 1 extra dice. Conversely, doesn't matter how many sources of disadvantage you have, you roll 1 extra dice and pick the lowest. And if you have any sources of both, they cancel each other out fully. It doesn't matter if you have 5 sources of advantage and 2 sources of disadvantage, both are fully cancelled out and you make a regular roll. This limits the grind of trying to find as many sources of advantage as possible. It makes the game a lot more fluid. You know that if there's disadvantage, all you have to do is find one source of advantage and you can cancel it out. And conversely, if you have any sources of advantage, you know that one source of disadvantage will cancel it out. There's no point trying to find 5 or 6 sources. It doesn't change the dice that you roll. And that's great. I think that the introduction of advantage and disadvantage is a really strong mechanic, and it certainly makes the game a lot faster and easier to play. The final bonus of Bounded Accuracy is result creep. Part of Bounded Accuracy is designed to stop results getting too high. Instead of adding lots of numbers, advantage and disadvantage change the distribution of results on a dice check. And I think this is great. It means that difficult tasks can still be challenging even at higher levels. If you have so many numerical bonuses that the minimum you can roll on a check is 30, then nothing is a challenge anymore. And that might sound ridiculous, but there are plenty of videos on YouTube of people showing you how to roll 50 or more on a stealth check. Bounded Accuracy really reduces this. It hasn't been perfect. Things have still snuck through gaps and lots of bonuses can end up applying. And one thing I wanted to do was introduce another mechanic that will reinforce Bounded Accuracy. Something that we can add to the system that will replace some numerical bonuses, but without interacting with advantage and disadvantage and therefore cancelling itself out. And I came up with rolling with dominance. Okay, let's just have a quick look at some numbers here so we can introduce the mathematical side. I've got a diagram here that shows the probability space of different dice results, and I've actually labelled the numbers 1 from 30. These are different results that you could possibly score. Let's imagine a skill check made with a +2 modifier. The smallest result we could get is a 3, and the largest we can get is a 22. If we have an additional +5 from some other source, this moves our envelope 5 spaces to the right. Our minimum result is now 8 and our maximum result is 27. Every additional modifier we add will shift that envelope further and further to the right, eventually making any low checks impossible to fail, and hard checks, even quite difficult ones, become a guaranteed success. This is not good. What advantage did is it changed the distribution without changing the maximum and minimum values. A straight D20 roll, a regular roll, has a flat probability distribution with each result being equally likely. Rolling with advantage makes the lower numbers less likely and the higher numbers more likely. So we have this probability distribution curve. This is just an approximate sketch of it. I didn't model the perfect curve for this, but you can see that rolling the very low numbers is quite unlikely and rolling the higher results is now much more likely. So if I'm introducing a new mechanic called dominance, when would we get to use it? Well, let's keep advantage as a general bonus, primarily given out for teamwork and environmental reasons. I think this works really nicely in the current system, but it does have a problem. There are certain circumstances where you don't need to work as a team because your class or other abilities give you advantage already. And I don't really like that. I think Dungeons & Dragons is a team-based game. It's best when players work together. I'd like to have a way of giving a mechanical bonus that's different from advantage, so that the advantage can cover the teamwork and the dominance can come from backgrounds and subclasses. Let's take the entertainer background. If I was to do that differently, I would say you can choose the type of entertainer you are. Let's pick a couple of examples. You could be a court entertainer, or you could be a tavern entertainer. And when entertaining in those circumstances, you get bonuses to charisma checks, and that bonus can be dominance. So what this means is you're still going to be better off if someone is accompanying you, giving you advantage. But in the specific circumstances of being in a court or a diplomatic session, you can use your knowledge of etiquette and sort of courtly music to make a better performance. If the courtly entertainer was trying to entertain in a tavern, sure, they'd still get a bonus for teamwork, but their specific skill set isn't as useful. On the other hand, the tavern entertainer would get dominance when performing in a tavern or a similar circumstance, but they wouldn't be able to use that to get a bonus when performing in court, because that's not what they're specialised in. So dominance is a very specific mechanical advantage, and it only occurs in very specific times. For the Trollsbane Barbarian, the Trollsbane Barbarian gets dominance against the creature that they've entangled fate with. Whatever the monster is they're hunting, they get dominance against that creature and that creature alone. Now, they can still get advantage from environmental reasons or the assist action or reckless attack, and that can be applied to any target. But dominance is only against one target at a time. How does dominance work? Well, this is the fun part. In terms of results, it's pretty much exactly the same as advantage and disadvantage. But in terms of mechanics, it's different. And because it's different, it can be combined or not, up to you. When you roll with dominance, you roll one additional d20 and discard the lowest result. And the opposite of dominance is lament. When you roll with lament, you roll one additional d20 and discard the highest result. Now, the mathematically astute of you may have noticed that the distribution of results for that will be exactly the same as advantage and disadvantage. If you roll 2 dice and pick the highest, that's advantage, and roll 2 dice and discard the lowest, that's dominance, you end up with exactly the same probability distribution. And this is by design. These mechanics do not change bounded accuracy. They still have a minimum score of 1 and a maximum score of 20 on the dice, which is great. It just changes the distribution of results. And they change it in the same way. But because they are applied differently, they can be combined. You can have advantage and dominance, and you can have advantage and lament. And conversely, you can have disadvantage and dominance and disadvantage and lament. This now opens up new opportunities for players and dungeon masters without breaking bounded accuracy, without adding any additional modifiers to worry about. And because dominance is only applied in very specific circumstances, it doesn't really slow the game down by searching for more sources of dominance or advantage. Okay, let's look at this in terms of decision space. With the current system, you have 3 options: disadvantage, regular, and advantage. That's nice and easy, nothing wrong with that. Under my system, by adding the dominance mechanic, instead of having 3 probability spaces, we have 9 probability spaces. What's nice about this is that mathematically it's not that complicated, because a lot of these are repetition. Disadvantage and lament by themselves effectively give the same distribution. Dominance and advantage by themselves give the same distribution. And rolling with disadvantage and dominance is exactly the same as rolling with advantage and lament. What this means is that although we now have a much larger probability space to work with different options, in terms of mathematical distributions, we only have 5 different distributions to worry about, and they are all bounded with the same bounded accuracy. This is quite nice. Let's have a look at how these results actually work. This is a cumulative distribution graph for the rolls of a D20. What it shows is the chance of meeting or beating a specific score. So for example, you have a 100% chance of rolling at least a 1 on a d20. You have a 50% chance of rolling at least an 11 and a 5% chance of rolling a 20. This is a straight line distribution. That means that each additional number that you add to your target number reduces the probability of success by the same amount. How does advantage work? Well, if you roll 2 dice and pick the highest, you are more likely to get a higher result. This means that the percentage chance of equaling or beating a score is always higher than a regular dice roll, except for 1, because in both circumstances you're guaranteed to roll a 1. Now, advantage has the biggest effect around the center of the distribution, around the score of 11. At that point, you have exactly a 25% greater chance of beating a score of 11. If we look at disadvantage, it's the same effect but mirrored. We are now always worse off, except for scoring 1 or more. And again, the biggest difference is around the score of 11. Instead of a 50% chance of beating 11, we now have a 25% chance of beating an 11. So disadvantage always gives a worse result than a regular dice roll. Rolling with dominance looks exactly the same as rolling with advantage, because rolling 2 dice and picking the highest is exactly the same as rolling 2 dice and discarding the lowest. It's the same mathematical distribution of results. And by the same token, rolling with lament looks exactly like rolling with disadvantage. Let's now look at the mixed result. I call this rolling with mediocrity. This is when you're rolling with advantage and lament, or rolling with disadvantage and dominance. How does this work? Let's look at rolling with advantage and lament. Advantage tells us to roll an extra dice and pick the highest. Lament tells us to roll an extra dice and discard the highest. So what we now do is we roll 3d20, we discard the highest result, and we look at the highest of what's remaining. This is effectively the same as rolling 3 dice and picking the middle result. On the other hand, if you're rolling with disadvantage and dominance, disadvantage tells us to roll 2 dice and pick the lowest result, and dominance tells us to roll an additional dice and discard the lowest of the 3. So you roll 3 dice, you discard the lowest, and you take the lowest of the 2 remaining. That's the middle result. So with mediocrity, you are rolling 3 dice and picking the middle one. What this means is you are more likely than a regular roll to get a low result, but less likely than a regular roll to succeed when you have a high target number. And the switching point where they're equal is 11 in the middle. Rolling with mediocrity makes you more likely to succeed easy tasks, but less likely to succeed hard tasks, which kind of sounds mediocre to me. That's the intention, and it works very nicely mathematically. Okay, what if we compare that to advantage and disadvantage? Well, you can see that mediocrity is better than disadvantage, but it's worse than advantage. I like the fact that mediocrity for easy tasks is better than a regular situation, but it's worse than a regular roll for tough tests to make. I find that very mathematically satisfying. Okay, what if we double up? What happens if we have dominance and advantage? Well, this graph shows the probability distribution. The top line is dominance and advantage. The middle line is either dominance or advantage, but not both. And the straight line, again, is just a regular roll. And what you'll see is that dominance and advantage together give a slight boost when compared to just advantage. It's not massive, and it's not meant to be a massive boost, but it is a boost nonetheless. So it is good to have both, but it's not game-breakingly good. And the same can be said for disadvantage and lament. If you have both, it is worse than disadvantage, but not so much worse that things become impossible. Just very difficult for the harder tasks. And that's what I was aiming for. Okay, so is this worth it? If I was in charge of Dungeons and Dragons and I was making a new version of Dungeons and Dragons, I would very seriously think about adding this as a core rule. And having it, like I said, reserved for specific circumstances, for subclasses and backgrounds. They allow you to get a small bonus that's not cancelled out if you have teamwork, and that applies to very specific circumstances in very specific situations. One thing I've talked about in a previous video is how having a bard makes the bard the best person to do the talking in almost all circumstances. And I don't like that. If you have a fighter with a soldier background, they should be better at talking to soldiers than the bard is. And having the bard as assistants to back the soldier up, certainly that's even better. Introducing a role like dominance allows this to happen in the game. It makes player characters have circumstances where they are definitely the right person to do the job, and if they can have someone helping them, then they're even better. And I like that. I like the idea of encouraging people to be the rock star when it's their character's turn to be the rock star, rather than the player with the highest charisma bonus always does all the talking. Rolling with dominance and lament adds an extra level of richness to the game without breaking bounded accuracy. It doesn't change the highest and lowest possible scores on a roll. It just slightly tweaks the distribution to make characters better at something in specific circumstances. And I like this. I think this is a good addition to the rules, and my barbarian subclass will be making use of it. So, what do you think of rolling with dominance? Do you think that would be a worthwhile addition for your games? Would you consider it too mathematically taxing, or is it an acceptable level of cognitive load for the storytelling opportunities that it provides? I'd like to hear your thoughts, and as always, enjoy your next game, whatever it may be.